Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Food Institute's webinar on fermentation. My name is Molly O'Donnell, and I'm the Corporate Engagement Project Manager here at the Good Food Institute. Today, my colleagues and I will cover the nascent but growing fermentation industry, including the commercial landscape, investments, scientific progress, regulatory and public funding updates, and industry forecasts. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, and we'll also do our best to answer questions via text during the presentation. I'll ask that you all add any questions to the Q&A box rather than the chat, as this helps us better track and respond to questions. For those of you not yet familiar with the Good Food Institute, we are an international nonprofit working to develop the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. We work across the areas of corporate engagement, science and technology, and policy to accelerate innovation in alternative proteins. And we're funded entirely by philanthropy. So if you find the insights and resources we provide useful, please consider making a donation. GFI's work focuses on feeding a growing population sustainably, efficiently, and safely. Industrial animal agriculture is responsible for almost 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and it uses 75% of agricultural land, yet it only provides a third of the global protein supply. Rather than asking consumers to give up the meat, egg, and dairy products they love, we focus on making these products in a way that doesn't contribute to environmental degradation or public health risk. And we do this by sharing open access research and resources, like the report we'll be discussing today, and by engaging directly with stakeholders across the food system, including manufacturers, distributors, investors, scientists, and policymakers. Today's webinar is part of a series based on GFI's annual State of the Industry reports released this month. I'd like to thank the many GFI team members who contributed to this project, as well as external partners who supported with data and fact-checking. GFI relies on our community to share the latest and greatest alternative protein-related data with you. So if you'd like to help make our reports, webinars, and other open access resources as accurate as possible, please tell us about your work by joining the company database and responding to surveys when we send them out. Signing up for a monthly industry newsletter is the best way to stay updated on our research. And today's presentation will focus on fermentation for alternative proteins. GFI defines fermentation as the use of single-cell fungi, mycelium, bacteria, microalgae, or other microbes as a production platform to modify or produce proteins, fats, or other functional ingredients. Fermentation is increasingly being used to produce ingredients as well as standalone alternative protein products. There are three main types of fermentation in the alternative protein industry. Traditional fermentation involves using live microorganisms to process plant-derived ingredients, resulting in products with unique flavor, nutritional profiles, and texture. Traditional fermentation has been used for thousands of years to make items like bread and beer. And in the alternative protein industry, traditional fermentation can be used to make cheese and yogurt, as well as improve the sensory, functional, and nutritional characteristics of plant-based meat. Please note that this presentation largely focuses on the other types of fermentation, and predominantly plant-based items like plant-based yogurt and plant-based cheese that might involve some traditional fermentation are instead covered in our plant-based webinar and report. And biomass fermentation leverages the fast growth and high protein content of microorganisms to produce large quantities of protein. The biomass can then be the main ingredient of a food product or serve as one of several ingredients in a blend. A range of microorganisms are currently being explored for applications in biomass fermentation, including yeast, filamentous fungi, and microalgae. Examples of products made with biomass fermentation include Meaty's mycelium steak and Corn's mycoprotein grounds. And finally, precision fermentation uses microorganisms as cell factories to produce specific functional ingredients. Precision fermentation also has a history in food and medicine. It's currently used to produce many vitamins, enzymes, and even hormones like insulin. And companies are now starting to leverage precision fermentation to make functional ingredients like egg proteins, dairy proteins, pepsin, heme, and fats. Examples of products made with precision fermentation include Perfect Day's animal-free whey and the Every Company's animal-free egg protein. So with a little background on the various types of fermentation, we can now look at some of the alternative protein applications for fermentation-derived products. As I mentioned, fermentation can be used to produce end products as well as ingredients for other categories of alternative proteins. For example, fermentation can be used to make growth factors for cultivated meat, flavorings and fats for plant-based meat, and standalone proteins. So with that primer, let's jump into the commercial landscape. There are now more than 130 companies dedicated to fermentation across 30 countries in every major world region. Please note that these figures are likely an underestimate, as it's common for companies to begin in stealth mode and announce themselves only upon completing a milestone like a fundraising round. Manufacturing capacity is one of the most significant bottlenecks in the fermentation industry, but 2022 did see progress. 3 companies opened fermentation facilities and 8 companies announced construction on new facilities. Notably, several of these facilities were financially supported by governments, including Change Foods' Abu Dhabi facility, Mycotechnology's Oman facility, and Perfect Day's Salt Lake City facility. Governments can play an important role in solving the fermentation manufacturing bottleneck while creating jobs and supporting climate goals. And many companies choose to manufacture using a contract manufacturing facility rather than a company-owned facility. This can be faster to market and more cost-effective for startups because a significant capital investment is required to open a new facility. But startups must compete for a limited number of contract manufacturing facilities able to accommodate fermentation production, and many of these aren't even optimized for alternative proteins. In 2022, progress was also made on contract manufacturing capacity, with the launch of 2 new startups, Liberation Labs and Planetary, dedicated to building fit-for-purpose alternative protein contract manufacturing facilities. Fermentation startup Synonym Bio also launched Capacitor, which is a free global database of available fermentation capacity. So while manufacturing capacity still remains a hurdle, it's exciting to see public and private actors alike working to tackle it. And 2022 also brought unprecedented industry collaboration. In a historic milestone, 12 companies co-founded the Fungi Protein Association, the first ever trade body for fermentation-enabled proteins. And in early 2023, 9 companies co-founded the Precision Fermentation Alliance. Both organizations will focus on fair and transparent regulatory policies, consumer research, and messaging. In addition to these milestones, fermentation companies continue to collaborate with one another across the value chain. We counted 21 new strategic partnerships in 2022, many of them between fermentation companies and major food companies. And several large food companies, Nestle, Unilever, and Bell Group, either launched products or announced plans to launch products made with precision fermentation. Speaking of product launches, 2022 was the biggest year yet for the commercial introduction of fermentation-enabled products. There are around 30 total precision fermentation product SKUs sold in US retail last year, around half of which were new. And a few companies also launched products in food service or direct-to-consumer. If you tried a fermentation-enabled alternative protein product last year, please tell us about it in the chat and let us know what you thought. And consumer research on perceptions of fermentation-enabled products is still pretty limited. However, existing research does point to consumer interest and willingness to try products made with fermentation. GFI is currently funding research on consumer perceptions and nomenclature for precision fermentation, and we're interested in chatting with anyone planning to conduct consumer research in this growing industry. If that's you, please email us at corporate@gfi.org. And as far as consumer-facing nomenclature goes, we're starting to see more companies coalescing around the terms animal-free and non-animal to describe proteins made with fermentation. This nomenclature parallels existing cheese industry terminology with rennet produced with precision fermentation, and it's also supported by consumer research. But as I mentioned, the alternative protein industry is nascent, and more research is needed to better understand consumer perceptions, nomenclature, and messaging. And with that, I'll pass things off to Daniel to discuss investments.
Thanks, Molly. My name is Daniel Gertner, and I'm the business analyst on the corporate engagement team here at GFI. Now we'll look at private investments in fermentation companies and how those investments fit into the larger economic landscape. Let's first look at broader alternative protein funding. Alternative protein investments totaled $2.9 billion in 2022, down 42% versus 2021. That decline tracked with the broader private investment environment. The drop in alternative proteins was only slightly larger than the 35% decrease in total global funding across all sectors in 2022. It was also smaller than the declines of some popular VC-funded sectors like fintech, which fell 46% year over year. So what trends are influencing these global investment declines? 2022 was a challenging funding environment for companies across industries. Falling public equity markets, rising interest rates due to high inflation, ongoing impacts of the pandemic, and the invasion of Ukraine all contributed to reduced investment activity across sectors in 2022. And in a relatively young sector like alternative proteins, a handful of large raises can heavily influence the top-line investment numbers. In 2022, for example, 3% of deals accounted for half of total investment dollars in alt proteins. So in a sector this size, one investment can have significant implications for year-to-year variations in investment totals. Over the longer term, cumulative investments in alternative proteins in the last decade reached $14 billion. So on average, alt protein investments nearly doubled every year over that span. Investments in fermentation companies totaled $842 million last year. That was the second highest annual investment total ever for the sector, behind only 2021's $1.7 billion. It also brought all-time fermentation investments to $3.7 billion. In 2022, fermentation investments accounted for nearly a third of all alternative protein funding, indicating that investors continue to diversify their holdings. Rather than focusing on a single pillar, investors are increasingly active across plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation companies. Investors are drawn to biomass and precision fermentation's methods for creating proteins, fats, and ingredients. Many view these technologies as likely to improve alternative proteins' taste and texture, which is a critical need for alternative protein products to achieve mass adoption. And investors seem likely to maintain their engagement with the category. Investors who responded to GFI's annual investor survey in 2022 demonstrated continued interest in investing in precision and biomass fermentation companies in 2023. Investments also became more global in 2022. The US has historically driven much of the alternative protein and fermentation investment totals. But while fermentation funding declined in the US and North America in 2022, it grew in Asia Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. Fermentation investments in Asia Pacific increased 67% to $95 million in 2022, while in Europe, they rose 37% to $188 million. Middle East funding rose from $6 million in 2021 to $147 million in 2022. Regional expansion around the globe is a positive sign. Investment capital that's diversified by region should help make the entire industry more resilient to future shocks. Engagement with the category from large food companies and food service providers is likely supporting the increased investor interest across fermentation technologies and regions. Product launches and partnerships in recent years from companies like Nestle, Unilever, and Starbucks have helped de-risk the space for investors. Plus, the entire sector is growing more developed as more companies and products approach market entry or expand their offerings. Half of the 25 total growth stage deals in fermentation took place in the last 2 years alone. The story for fermentation-enabled foods in the market has only just begun. We expect significant developments in the coming years as more companies approach commercialization. Investments in alternative proteins are crucial for the industry's scale-up as an urgently important but underinvested climate mitigation solution. Animal agriculture contributes 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet alternative protein and fermentation investments comprise only a small fraction of total climate technology funding. At the same time, the over $500 billion in total climate investments made each year have contributed to renewable energy today, constituting more than a quarter of global power generation. Meanwhile, alt protein meat sales make up less than 1% of the global meat market. Increased public and private investment in alternative proteins can help this nascent sector achieve considerable global impact. And impact often begins with measurement. To help industry participants assess some of the climate and other non-financial characteristics of alt proteins, GFI and FAIR developed a new set of environmental, social, and governance, or ESG frameworks for the alternative protein industry. These frameworks help investors better understand the consequences of their investments. So stepping back, we know the alt protein industry has a long way to go before delivering on its potential. The investment gap between alt proteins and other climate tech indicates a huge opportunity for growth in alternative proteins, but they need to continue to attract the capital that can help them scale. And now I'll pass it to Adam to cover updates in fermentation science and technology.
Thanks, Daniel, and hello all. I'm Adam Lehman, lead scientist in fermentation here at GFI. Together with my colleague Lucas, we'll update you on exciting progress in the science and technology of fermentation-derived alt proteins. At GFI, we describe fermentation generally as biomanufacturing products, such as alternative protein food ingredients from microbes. To produce these ingredients, the selected strains and feedstocks are brought together in a bioreactor and processed for purification. Bioprocess development must optimize final product quality, titer, yield, CapEx, and OpEx to create an integrated, commercially viable process. Throughout 2022, there were developments across the technology stack, from end product target selection, strain development, feedstock optimization, and bioprocess engineering. Success in target selection and design balances many considerations, such as molecule functionality, food applications, regulatory oversight, price, demand, and IP. In 2022, a key trend was using AI-backed machine learning to find novel functional proteins for foods. DeepMind's AlphaFold 2 generates fast and reliable protein structure predictions using AI. Companies like Augmented Reality, Shiru, and Proterra have emerged using AI-backed platforms for protein prediction as well. Meanwhile, strain development focuses on bringing out the best features of a microbial strain, maximizing productivity and minimizing undesirable qualities. Last year saw innovations around improvement of egg white and dairy protein precision fermentation. For instance, researchers at VTT, the Protein Brewery, and the Every Company all worked on production of ovalbumin, an egg white protein, but each achieved important improvements in different workhorse fungi, like Trichoderma, Aspergillus, and Pichia. Iron-binding proteins are important alt protein ingredients as well, and in 2022, Impossible Foods demonstrated improved legemoglobin H fermentation in Pichia. Triton Algae Innovations revealed Chlamydomonas strains that produce iron complex proteins and developed a color-fast red pigment strain. And Cargill signaled their interest in precision fermentation with progress on iron-binding protein and a natural thermolabile red pigment. There was also an increased interest in machine learning to improve strain design, which can greatly accelerate R&D through improved design, build, test, learn cycles. Strategic use of machine learning shows promise in big data analysis to drive efficient R&D cycles. Microbial fermentation provides an efficient production method for lipids, like fats and oils, that are identical to those found in animals or plant seeds. In fact, fats are key to bridging the taste gap between plant-based and animal-based meats. Fermentation can produce nutritionally important molecules like omega-3s and produce oils in far more sustainable ways than tropical oil plantations. Throughout 2022, researchers around the world further explored microbial oil and fatty acid fermentation. For example, new findings have extended our knowledge of Yaroia yeast fatty acid trafficking, lipid accumulation, and its potential to make triacylglycerols, like those present in human milk. GFI grantees Dr. Kyra Boundy-Mills, Dr. Salma Yusuf, and Dr. Nazneen Sofeo continued their research on oleaginous yeast and microalgae in 2022 as well. And there was a lot of commercial scientific progress across this sector. Companies like C16 Biosciences, Clean Food Group, No Palm Ingredients, Nourish, and Yali Bio continued developing microbial oil ingredients from oleaginous yeast. And in microalgae fermentation, Corbion demonstrated their oil strain development, while ATK Biotech received GRAS approval for their microalgae-derived omega-3 DHA. Please check out the report for even more highlights. And in a bioprocess, feedstocks are the materials used as a source of carbon, nitrogen, and energy for microorganisms to grow and make products. Optimizing feedstocks can cut cost, reduce waste, and improve the sustainability of fermentation. Currently, most fermentations rely on glucose derived from crops like corn or sucrose extracted from sugar crops like sugarcane. However, research and development is underway to optimize, valorize, and diversify carbon sources. Last year, there was a continued interest in conversion of waste, like lignocellulosic biomass and municipal solid waste, into fermentable sugars. This area of interest was also highlighted in the recent Bold Goals for U.S. Biomanufacturing report by the White House Office of Science and Technology. For side stream valorization, many researchers publish findings on novel ag side stream feedstocks, such as date fruit, molasses, potato starch, processing water, and more. Efforts are also being made to diversify beyond sugar by using microorganisms like photoautotrophic microalgae or chemoautotrophic bacteria that grow on carbon sources like waste gases. There were several gas fermentation patents published this past year from Solar Foods and Air Protein. To produce fermentation-derived ingredients, the selected strains and feedstocks are brought together in a bioreactor to produce the end product target. Here's Lucas Eastham to talk about the progress there in 2022.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. I'm Lucas Eastham, Senior Scientist focused on fermentation here at GFI, and I'd like to discuss progress in bioprocess development in 2022. So while bioreactors are central to the bioprocess, a commercial fermentation process includes steps from upstream, USP, to downstream production. Upstream processing, or USP, involves the microbe inoculation, the seed train, the preparation and sterilization of the medium, the equipment sterilization, and then inoculation and production growth in the main bioreactor. This year, a few highlights and advances included process monitoring and control, continuous culture processes, as well as co-cultivation systems. Process monitoring and control in a bioreactor is very important for maximizing microbial growth and productivity. This year, we saw Ecovata Design had a patent application covering control processes for their solid-state fermentation production systems. And in precision fermentation, the Every company had a patent application for a machine learning system for optimization of USP productivity. Improvements to cultivation modes like fed batch and continuous cultivation can also greatly improve cost and productivity. For instance, Solar Foods published a patent for a continuous culture bioprocess for their single-cell protein biomass grown from gas feedstocks. Finally, co-cultivation of different microorganisms can also improve productivity or even the organoleptic properties of the final product. There were patent applications from startups Aquacultured Foods and Coralla Foods, who are both developing novel alternative seafood products through the co-cultivation of a fungi with either a bacteria or a microalgae, respectively. On the other side, DSP spans the harvest, dewatering, extraction, and concentration of the fermentation product from either the biomass, the solid fraction, or the supernatant, the liquid fraction. The depicted DSP process below shows a typical protein extraction and concentration process. Downstream processing can be a significant portion of the operating costs, yet it's often underconsidered when initially designing a process. Thus, improved biomass downstream processing can help unlock better taste, texture, and formulation options. There were a number of patents published in this area for fungal biomass products, such as from the Better Meat Company, Protein Brewery, and Mycorrhiza. Downstream processing innovations can also open the door to new microorganisms. For instance, NobleGen published a patent for protein extraction from their microalga, Euglena, and formulation with that protein extract. Finally, microbial fats and oils have very unique downstream processing methods, which can be a bottleneck for commercialization. Thus, advances in microbial lipid extraction will significantly help grow this sector. A typical microbial extraction process uses a solvent-based process, and the plant-based green solvent, methoxylane, was recently approved by EFSA as an alternative to hexane-based extractions. Alternatively, Corbion published a patent for a high-pressure expeller press method to improve cost and efficiency for their microbial oil extraction process. Now, it's been said many times before that the looming shortage of available fermentation manufacturing capacity is one of the biggest hurdles the fermentation industry will face. That being said, however, the road to manufacturing readiness requires the fermentation process to be technologically mature and ready for deployment at scale. This requires iteration of the design, build, test, learn cycles across the lab, pilot, and demonstration scales, which should then also feed into techno-economic analysis of the process at every stage. In 2022, Biomade published the BioMRL framework, which provides a very nice process development guide to help identify and mitigate risks in scaling biomanufacturing. Pilot and demonstration scale facilities like ABPDU, IBRL, and Biobase Europe provide crucial process development services, and they continued serving the sector throughout 2022. Boston Bioprocess launched their contract bioprocess service this past year, and Perfect Day launched an enterprise scale-up service called Nth Bio to leverage their commercialization expertise. Be on the lookout for the GFI fermentation manufacturing capacity analysis coming out later this summer. Finally, a note on the GFI Research Grant Program. Researchers around the globe are eager to contribute to advances in alternative protein. And in the last 4 years, GFI's grants program has funded $17 million worth of proposals across all 3 pillars. In 2022 alone, GFI accepted 21 grant proposals for a total of $3.9 million in research funding, with 5 grants going to fermentation-based projects. Thank you to our donors who helped make this possible. So be on the lookout for the 2023 call for proposals later this year. I'll now pass it along to my colleague Maddie for some updates on regulation and public funding.
Thanks, Lucas. My name is Maddie Cohen. I'm the Senior Regulatory Attorney on the policy team at GFI, and I'll provide a brief overview of regulatory frameworks and updates in just a few key jurisdictions. Starting with the EU. The EU's novel food regulation applies to novel products of fermentation, and the EU also has a regulation specific to GM foods, which may also apply to some fermentation products. But under both regulations, novel products do require pre-market approval. So companies have to apply to EFSA, which will conduct a pre-market safety assessment for the food. As part of this process, companies have to disclose any studies that were commissioned on their product to EFSA, and then EFSA will use these as part of its overall safety assessment. If the results of EFSA's assessment are positive, then the European Commission and member states can vote to approve the novel food. And once a product is approved, that approval applies in all EU member states. So far, 2 of Myco Technologies' FermentIQ protein ingredients have been approved by EFSA, and several other companies have applications pending. And Impossible's heme product is pending both under the novel food and GM food regulations. So it's possible that certain fermentation-derived ingredients will need approval under 2 separate pathways in the EU. In the UK, after leaving the EU, the country did retain this same novel food and GM food and feed regulation structure and the same pre-market approval process, which is currently conducted by the UK Food Standards Agency. But the agency did announce in 2022 that they're considering new regulatory models for novel foods. So this may change in coming years, and there may be a separate framework for pre-market approval of novel fermentation-derived foods. In Singapore, the Singapore Food Agency has once again updated its guidance for novel food safety assessments. And the guidance specifically includes sections both on biomass and precision fermentation, which is really helpful for companies to understand what information to provide the agency when applying for pre-market approval. And this guidance is regularly updated by SFA and available on the agency's website. And in 2022, SFA was the first regulator to approve Solar Foods' micro-based protein ingredient, Solein. In Australia and New Zealand, the regulator FSAMS pre-approves novel foods. Impossible received final approval not too long ago for their heme ingredient using this process. And FSAMS, interestingly, also works with Health Canada, which is the Canadian food regulator, on a joint process for safety assessments of GM foods. So if a company is looking to have a GM food approved in both jurisdictions, you can apply jointly, and the countries will conduct a single safety assessment that then they can each use during their respective approval processes, which can save the company and the countries both time. In Israel, just last week, the PM announced the first regulatory approval for a fermentation-derived milk protein in the country, approving Remilk's whey protein, which is very exciting. And then in India, over the past year, the Food Safety and Standards Authority has amended a few of its food regulations, including its regulation that governs the approval of non-specified novel foods, which will apply to most fermentation-derived ingredients and products. They also proposed new regulations for GM foods, which would change both the pre-market approval and labeling process. And they did approve Perfect Days animal-free milk proteins. In the US, as many of you know, FDA is the agency with regulatory authority over fermentation-derived foods. And the process is a bit different than in countries that use a single pre-market approval process. There are two potential regulatory pathways that FDA allows to ensure that novel ingredients and foods are safe to be sold in the US. The first is the food additive petition pathway, which is a pretty lengthy process that involves consultation with the FDA and a petition to the agency requesting them to issue a regulation that specifically allows certain uses of an ingredient or additive. The second, more common pathway is the GRAS notice pathway. GRAS stands for generally recognized as safe and means that an ingredient is recognized as safe among qualified experts under the specific conditions of its intended use. So a company believing that its ingredient is GRAS for an intended use has two options. It is possible to use the ingredient without submitting a GRAS notice if the company has full confidence in their GRAS status, but more commonly, you'd submit a GRAS notice to FDA laying out the intended use of the product and justifying its status as GRAS with studies, data, and opinions from qualified experts. And then in response to that notice, FDA can either inform the applicant that there's not enough information available to determine that the product is GRAS, or that there is enough information and issue what's called a no questions letter, which isn't technically a pre-market approval, but rather an indication that FDA doesn't question or disagree with the company's conclusion that its product is GRAS. And a number of companies have received these no questions letters from FDA for products of fermentation, including Impossible, Every, Nature's Find, Perfect Day, as well as some biomass fermentation companies. In the US, there aren't currently any federal labeling regulations that are specific to fermentation-derived foods, although the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard promulgated by USDA could apply to some products. But FDA is in the process of drafting guidance for labeling plant-based alternatives to animal-derived foods, which could kind of preview the agency's thinking on fermentation-derived alternatives. And then, as Molly mentioned, in terms of nomenclature, there's been research conducted recently that found consumers in the US and several other countries prefer the term animal-free dairy for products that contain milk proteins created through precision fermentation because it's considered direct, simple, and clear. And this is a term that several companies already use, or they use non-animal dairy, which is a similar term. On the other hand, biomass companies tend to use more unique identifiers for their proteins like Fermotene, Rhiza, Phi, Promixylene, and Abunda. We might get more information from the FDA in the future on how they expect both categories of products to be labeled, but for now, it's a bit of a gray area. And with that, I will pass it to Michael to discuss public funding.
Thanks so much, Maddie. I'm Michael Carter, Policy Associate here at GFI. 2022 saw some of the biggest public funding milestones yet from governments as they invested in building out resilient domestic food sources amid global uncertainty. So the Netherlands, which is known for its innovation in agriculture, made the world's largest investment in cellular agriculture with a 60 million euro initiative that includes R&D, commercialization support, education, and workforce transition resources. The government of Finland followed not far behind with more than 30 million euros for Solar Foods, which we've heard about as a microbe fermentation company. And that will help them finish one domestic factory and begin construction on a second. The United States and Canada both took actions to support future fermentation capabilities, with President Joe Biden releasing an executive order calling on agencies to produce a report on how biotechnology and biomanufacturing could be used to cultivate new food sources. So the resulting Bold Goals report, which we just heard about, was published last month, and it positions alternative proteins, including fermentation-derived products, as a key component of a future American biomanufacturing ecosystem. Finally, we saw past commercialization support from the European Union come to fruition with the opening of a biomass fermentation facility in the Netherlands that uses side stream products from a nearby starch plant to create high-value protein. So on the next slide, we'll see even more examples of governments making the most of fermentation's potential for side stream valorization, as Adam mentioned earlier. So the country of Oman produces roughly twice as many dates as it can consume or export, leading to food waste and lost economic value. The nation's sovereign wealth fund partnered with an American company to develop a facility that will use these dates to create a nutritious protein product, value-adding date production in the country and supplying a new domestic food source in an unpredictable global food system. Australia made a similar move, partnering with a different American company to develop a fermentation process that will use inedible fibers from sugarcane to produce dairy proteins. Elsewhere in the Middle East and Asia, governments supported the development of new products by providing infrastructure and lab space. Singapore continued its plans to build a massive food tech innovation center and partnered with ADM to offer contract manufacturing, lab space, and pilot facilities to startups, while Israel put out a request for proposals at the end of the year to build pilot facilities for precision fermentation in the country. Finally, China indicated increased attention to fermentation as a food source and industry of the future, with the nation's bioeconomy 5-year plan and President Xi Jinping himself mentioning food sources from microorganisms as part of a drive for more protein diversification. All in all, governments responded to uncertainty across the food system and the benefits of fermentation's flexible and efficient platform by investing in infrastructure, facilities, and domestic capabilities. So now I'll pass it to Daniel for the forecast.
Thank you, Michael. Now we'll look at the alternative protein and fermentation forecasting landscape. The fermentation pillar of alternative proteins is uniquely difficult to forecast. Fermentation as a technology is thousands of years old, but biomass and precision fermentation, the technologies that are most often applied to alternative proteins, are relatively new to the sector. Plus, the various forms of fermentation often don't share addressable markets. In general, biomass fermentation aims to replace traditional center-of-the-plate meat, eggs, and dairy. It does so by producing large amounts of high-protein products that mirror the sensory experience of those conventional items, similar to the plant-based meat industry. Precision fermentation, on the other hand, uses microbes to create animal-free yet bioidentical proteins and fats. These can be used as ingredients in alternative protein products. So these technologies can work together to create alternative protein products, but the technologies often don't compete directly. So rather than publish fermentation-specific forecasts, most organizations opt to wrap fermentation into their larger alternative protein market projections. These forecasts universally predict growth for the alternative protein industry. Estimates range from a $90 billion to a $1.1 trillion market for alternative proteins by 2040. But while the potential for rapid growth is promising, forecasts themselves don't make any given outcome any more likely. On the other hand, they can help us identify key factors that might influence market development. Fermentation faces a number of supportive factors and roadblocks to mass market adoption. Traditional fermentation benefits from widespread public knowledge and consumer acceptance of the technology. Biomass fermentation also benefits from positive consumer perceptions, along with taste and texture functionality and strong sustainability credentials. And precision fermentation is supported by its ability to create animal-free, yet bioidentical fats and proteins. At the same time, traditional fermentation can struggle to, on its own, achieve the taste and texture of many animal products. Biomass fermentation faces a number of regulatory hurdles, especially in Europe, along with some capacity limitations. And precision fermentation faces its own set of cost hurdles and distributional challenges before it can grow to a much larger scale. While those challenges are significant, the fact remains that conventional meat consumption continues to expand. The FAO projects that the global meat market will grow from 360 million metric tons in 2022 to 455 million metric tons by 2050. Key global goals like hitting emission reduction benchmarks, restoring biodiversity, improving food security, and protecting public health are impossible to achieve by continuing with current methods of meat production. Biomass, precision, and traditional fermentation can all play important roles in transforming the global protein supply. So where is the fermentation market headed? As more products enter the market, consumers will grow increasingly familiar with fermentation-enabled foods. Clarity in Europe around mycelium's novel food status could help de-risk investments in biomass fermentation. Precision fermentation will continue to advance dairy, egg, and meat solutions. And as the industry grows, hybrid products made with fermentation-derived alongside plant-based or cultivated ingredients will become increasingly common in the marketplace. That's likely to boost alternative proteins' taste and sensory experiences. Plus, increased global interest should support sales of and investments in fermentation-derived products. All of these things will play important roles in supporting the growth of both the fermentation industry and the larger alternative protein market. And with that, I'll pass it back to Molly.
Thanks, Daniel, and thank you all for tuning into our presentation on fermentation for alternative proteins. The fermentation industry has made remarkable progress over the past year, but we know that there's still a long road toward building a world in which alternative proteins are no longer alternative. So if you're involved in the fermentation industry, we want to stay in touch. Please sign up for our newsletter to stay looped into GFI resources and events. And with that, let's begin the Q&A. Again, please add your questions to the Q&A box rather than the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. So our first question, I think, will be for Adam and Lucas. Someone's asking if we have figures on how much energy we need to achieve the 10% global meat market by fermented meat. So I'm not sure, I suspect we don't have a sort of exact answer to that question, but I think what this question is really getting at is thinking about, energy efficiency and fermentation, how that might compare to conventional meat production, and what it can offer from, a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. It's a great question. And it's one that I think points to some of the abilities of fermentation to take in energy from a lot of different sources. So we know now too, and I think it's been captured really well here, that the fermentation industry is changing rapidly. Technology is improving, the processes are becoming more efficient, and the organisms are also becoming more efficient to have more yield and produce more protein per gram of carbon that gets put in a feedstock. But one of the things that I think is really promising is taking fermentation and using the power that we can get from clean energy sources like solar and wind to power those facilities rather than something that causes more greenhouse gas emissions. And using that kind of clean energy in combination with fermentation is likely the way forward to making really low carbon solutions for making all proteins.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. And next question here, I'll direct first to Michael and then Sharon. Someone's asking how many dollars of investments in alternative protein industries are needed to accelerate the plant-based tradition. They said, I think we would say, towards working toward this world we want in which all proteins are no longer alternative. I'm curious if we've seen any figures on sort of that dollar amount.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and for those listening, we did answer this question in writing as well. There are links to some of the resources that we've shared, so you can also take a look at the Q&A answered questions. So this is, of course, a very important question, and I like the thinking on the quadrillions. I don't know if we need quite that much. It's true that we certainly need a lot of capital to scale this industry, both to support continued research and development, and then importantly to scale manufacturing, right? We have a lot of things to build to support the scale up. There are a few papers that have been published that answer this question and look at both private funding and public funding. So there's one paper that I linked by the Rockefeller Foundation and BCG that said that to meet net zero targets by 2050, so that was their benchmark, the sector needs to replace 30% of meat with alternatives. And for that, they said that there is $40 billion in annual investment needs to stimulate and sustain adoption. And now, of course, if you want to scale that 30% to a higher number, there's going to be an increase in funding annually that's required. Another report which looks at public funding, and this was co-funded by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and the Climate Works Foundation, says that for government support specifically for public funding, we need about $10 billion per year. And that if we did this, the alternative proteins industry could employ 9.5 million people and generate 1.1 trillion in gross value added to the global economy. And I think part of the reason we see this difference in funding amount is that public funding can be quite higher leverage than private funding, especially if we think about something like research and development dollars, which then can fund open access research, right? This is something GFI does, we believe in strongly, and this can lift up the entire industry rather than supporting individual companies' IP. So I'll stop there and see if Michael has anything to add.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. The 10.1 billion per year in the Global Innovation Needs Assessment is split into 4.4 billion on research and development, and then the remainder on commercialization support. And so as Sharon spoke to, the public nature of open access research is really important as it lifts everyone up. But that also extends to commercialization support. So when governments provide loan guarantees or direct financing to help build facilities that are going to need to be bigger than the existing facilities we have that don't have a history of commercial operation. Once they establish that history of commercial viability with one facility or two, that allows for private lenders to feel more comfortable jumping in the pool with everyone else. And so we've seen that dynamic at play with industrial scale renewable energy. And that's exactly the kind of investment we need from governments. And it lifts everybody up.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. And that's a great segue into another question. Someone would love for us to expand more on efforts for receiving funding from the US government. So this person noted that funding within Europe and the Middle East seems to be common and pretty supportive. You know, I know there have been some public funding updates in North America, but Michael, I'd love for you to speak to public funding in North America and maybe some as specific tactics or value propositions that might be sort of working with the US government, or like reasons why, the US or Canadian governments would want to invest in fermentation enabled proteins.
Yeah, so that's a great observation. We absolutely have seen a higher level of support for commercializing, especially commercializing fermentation abilities in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And especially this year, a lot of that was driven by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which caused massive food supply shocks, especially in that area. Even in the United States as well, we felt that and reflected in our food prices, but not nearly as directly. So in Canada, we've seen efforts to increase research and development, as well as a partnership between a government run nonprofit and a producer of bioreactors, which is we don't often see, but obviously bioreactors are going to be a major part of developing a fermentation industry. And so that's been, there have been developments there towards building biomanufacturing capabilities. And in the US, honestly, the level of investment has not really been on par with what we've seen in other countries, but the Bold Goals report recently published is very encouraging on that front, positioning alternative proteins and fermentation really at the center of a future biotechnology industry in the United States, as well as other placement in more recently less recently, this past October, the National Strategy on Advanced Manufacturing. We saw similar mentions to alternative proteins. So we're seeing encouraging signs that funding may increase, but it's an excellent observation.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. And keeping on the government theme, someone is asking what our engagement of local, state, and federal agencies looks like with regard to support of fermentation and alternative proteins. So I don't know, either Michael or Maddie, feel free to jump on and speak to that one.
Sure, I can speak to that one. So we have kind of a few different levels of engagement. At the local and state level, we do state lobbying, both looking to get funding for R&D or funding for scale up and for workforce development. On the federal level, we obviously do both federal lobbying for funding, but also federal regulatory advocacy. So we take meetings and submit comments to agencies like USDA and FDA, and sometimes other related agencies to promote a fair playing field for alternative proteins and make sure that any new regulations or guidance that's coming out is not going to treat alternative proteins differently from conventional foods. And then on kind of the global level, we work with multilateral organizations like the WHO, FAO, the Codex Alimentarius Commission to try to ensure kind of global harmonization of how these products are regulated and ensure that it's not just easy for these products to come to market in the US, but in jurisdictions all around the world.
Awesome. Thanks, Maddie. And we got one question around our methodology for the facilities slide that I presented. So all of that is either publicly available information. So pretty much every week, every month, we are scraping news articles for alternative protein industry updates. That's where a lot of our updates come in the state of the industry reports, as well as in our alternative protein opportunity newsletter. And then where things are unclear in those newsletters, we'll fact check directly with the companies. So if you feel like my company opened a facility and we're not represented in that graphic, please email us or fill out a feedback form. Maybe a GFI or Backstage could drop the state of the industry feedback form in the chat. We can also make sure it's included in the post-webinar follow-up email. But we do try our best, obviously, to make sure that the news and updates that we're sharing are as accurate as possible. But we also do really rely on the alternative protein community to help fact check our work, and definitely speak up if you have an update or a facility or something that's not represented in a GFI resource. We'd love to correct that. So next question here, someone is asking about the main cost drivers for alternative proteins versus meat, and also for precision fermentation specifically.
Sure, I can take that one, Molly. Fermentation is a very big world, and we have many different microorganisms and many different products that are made by fermentation and even precision fermentation. So we can be talking about highly active proteins like enzymes, or just lipids and non-active molecules that are providing functional properties. So it really depends on the product target. Let's talk about enzymes for a second, because those are the most established. You have organisms that are producing in the 50 to 100 gram per liter, ideally, in terms of their titer range, which really helps with the cost factor. So having a high titer from your organism, and that's helping them get down to less than $10 per kg for those enzymes in commercial production. So I think where we're at in the alternative protein space from precision fermentation is we need to make progress in the titers, right? We're looking at new molecules, and we need to have higher titers. But alongside of that, we need to have higher yields. So that means either improved downstream processes, where we can have yields of 80 to 90% plus, so that we're not losing product in the downstream process, but also more efficient bioprocesses like continuous cultivation, where you can have more batches within a year, less downtime, right? If you have downtime in a production facility, that's lost potential revenue of product. So you need tighter, higher yields, and we need to be able to scale up our facilities. There are cost savings with scale. It's not the only answer, but we do get cost savings with scales, and also more efficient, low cost facilities would be helpful.
Wonderful, thanks. And someone just asked, this is a great question. Could fermentation equipment from alcohol manufacturing like beer or wine be retrofitted for alternative proteins?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So be on the lookout later this year for a GFI analysis on fermentation capacity. And one of the questions that we delve into is thinking about trying to understand fermentation capabilities from other parts of the fermentation industry and see what could be retrofit for protein production. And we have some preliminary answers, and we'll be excited to share those with you probably in the summer. So one of the big takeaways there is that there are going to be some key differences and similarities that may have some overlap that allow us to use some equipment to quickly retrofit, and some things may take more time.
Awesome, thank you. And another question just came in on the reason for lack of scaling the bioreactors. So this person, I think, is wanting to know, what are the technical challenges, or maybe there are cost challenges with the lack of manufacturers to build them, or there's an issue with the raw materials, or a technical issue with scaling the process, or maybe all of the above. What are the specific kind of challenges with scaling bioreactors?
Yeah, so I mean, it's all of the above. I mean, I think the big part is, you've got your three things. You've got financing, right? You have to have good financing. You have to have a good end product, right? So what is your cost of goods sold? Do you have a really good process where your cost of goods sold will match the offtake in the demand side? So your supply side financials need to match the demand side, and then your bioprocess needs to be optimized for commercial production. And so that's where we talk about, iterating the design, build, test, learn cycle across the lab, pilot, and demonstration scales, so that you can have a really tight techno-economic analysis that kind of de-risks the financial side, right, from the capital side of investors, to then give you money to scale that. And we're just coming into a point now in the bioeconomy where we're beginning to be able to make all these new products via fermentation, and it's capacity that just hasn't existed before, and it needs to be built over time, which will take money and time.
Thanks, Lucas. So next question here is on if US and American innovators benefit from IP developed elsewhere in fermentation and alternative protein research. So I think this is and the person can also write in if I'm misunderstanding the question, but I think maybe about sort of the role of IP. Sometimes it's, used by one company. When is that IP, able to be licensed or maybe sourced in an open access way through, undergraduate courses, et cetera. So I don't know, Adam, if you'd like to speak to that.
Sure. First, this is an industry that's moving faster than I think any other fermentation industry ever has before. So there are a lot of people trying to put together pieces of the puzzle on the development side and in strain improvement side in academic labs at institutes, but also within companies. And those companies have a keen interest in protecting their IP. So we do see some of the information coming out as they disclose them in patent applications, and then we're able to see how that might work in terms of licensing frameworks, or how it could be extrapolated to something more basic that could be researched. But there are definitely public-private partnerships where companies are interested in licensing or collaborating with universities to have them see how a particular piece of technology or biology may help elsewhere and could be researched.
Awesome. Thank you, Adam. And I think that was the last question that we'll have time for today. So Thank you all so much for joining our presentation on fermentation. Just a reminder that the final presentation in the series will cover the plant-based industry. That will be this Thursday, same time, 12 noon Eastern. And again, the recording and slides will also be sent out to you all shortly. So thank you everyone so much for joining, for asking great questions, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.